Tej Johnson, Kayshawn Boutte, Troy Franklin, Joe Flacco. We talked about them all last week as high risk, high reward starts in week 8, and it paid off. Now we turn to week 9, and injuries and bye weeks continue to hit us. So let's talk about some high risk, start sit, flex options and whether or not you can trust them in week 9. Fantasy managers were riding the high of Rico Dowdle and his 30-plus point fantasy performances, hoping that he would retain the job. On the opposite side, Chuba Hubbard managers were anticipating his return in hopes that he would just reclaim his role as the lead back. Both sides were smacked in the face with a very unappealing committee that has completely limited the upside and reliability of both running backs. However, one thing has been very clear. Rico Dowdle has outperformed Chuba Hubbard, and it hasn't even been close. And fantasy managers, they are not the only ones noticing. Head coach Dave Canales spoke out on this backfield this week, and his wording wasn't super specific, but it did imply that we could see a potential shift towards a more reliable workload for Rico Dowdle. Still, because we haven't outright been told that there will be specific changes, Rico Dowdle does remain a risky flex play this week with snaps favoring Chuba Hubbard over the past 2 matchups. If the Panthers were to adjust and increase snaps for Dowdle, he would excel. He is averaging 5.71 yards per carry. He is top 5 in NFL next-gen stats in both efficiency and rush yards over expected. Dowdle is a risk, but he is a risk that could pay off this week if they do shift those snaps. Relying on Croskey Merritt at this point is perhaps one of the riskiest plays that fantasy managers continue to lean into week after week. He has shown incredible upside, so I get it. He has finished before with 27 fantasy points in PPR, finishing as the RB5 in week 5 against the LA Chargers. But after that stellar performance, he has consistently put out a maximum of 5 fantasy points over the past 3 games. When you look at his season as a whole, there's truly not much in terms of reliability. In 8 games, he has managed to hit double-digit fantasy points just 3 times. One of those was just barely hitting double-digit fantasy points, if we can even count that. The bigger issue here is that we cannot rely on him to produce in good matchups. He underperformed in what should have been excellent matchups against Chicago and Dallas, but there is some good news here. His best performances have come in 3 games that Washington won. That makes logical sense. The Commanders only trust him on the ground at this point, so in games where the Commanders are playing from behind, his upside will naturally be capped. But the bigger problem here is that in those wins, those were lopsided wins. In games that were relatively close, where the Commanders didn't abandon the run, he still underperformed. So on a Washington team that has been struggling and dealing with injuries, you were continuing to try to rely on him to excel, but you're looking for a blowout for him to have any upside. So basically, we turn to him this week in a matchup with Seattle, and we are hoping that Jane Daniels' return can push this into somehow a blowout victory that favors Croskey Merritt. But even with Jane Daniels back, I don't anticipate this being a blowout because Seattle is a good team and they have been a 3-point favorite. So we're in a difficult situation yet again with Croskey Merritt being a high risk, very low floor play this week. I don't know if we want to turn to him. Even with thin options available at RB2, you probably need to look somewhere else. We've had big boom weeks from the San Francisco receiving corps, and Jauan Jennings did have a top 12 finish in week 2, but that was a long time ago. And outside of that performance, Jennings has failed to have higher than 8 fantasy points in any game this year. Over the past 2 weeks, he has reassumed his role as the wide receiver 1. That's awesome, right? But unfortunately, that title has become a little bit meaningless with the 49ers leaning so heavily on Christian McCaffrey, both on the ground and through the air. The 49ers offense has become very inconsistent in general and a little bit hard to predict in terms of pass volume over the past several weeks. This week's matchup against the Giants is intriguing. The Giants have definitely had their moments on defense this season where it seemed like they were trending in a solid direction, but they have fallen apart recently against the pass, allowing significant fantasy production over the past several weeks. But moreover, this is the issue, they have also been reeling against the run, and San Francisco will likely try to lean on Christian McCaffrey and get him going again this week. So if the 49ers can't get an uptick in pass volume, we are heading to another disappointing performance from Jennings. Given the injuries and bye weeks, fantasy managers, you might have to turn to him as a flex option because he is an actual wide receiver 1 on his team, but he does lack stability. He is playing through multiple injuries. There are likely better options that you can turn to this week with higher upside. Caleb Williams has been a risky start all season, even in good matchups, but technically speaking, he is one of the safer streaming options this week at quarterback, and that is very, very indicative of the current state of fantasy quarterbacks. But his matchup this week against Cincinnati, that does help lower the risk here. While Williams has been underwhelming in what should have been strong matchups over the past several weeks, particularly Baltimore and New Orleans, his best performance this year, where he did finish as the overall QB1, was against Dallas. Cincinnati and Dallas are very on par defensively. The Bengals have truly been ripped apart this year with only a few outlier performances, and they are coming off a game, we talked about this, where they allowed 244 passing yards to Justin Fields, a guy who was going to lose his job. Ironically, to the point that I mentioned earlier, that was his second highest passing yards of the season behind who? You guessed it. Dallas. Again, these are two very similar defensive teams. Now, Caleb Williams' inconsistency has been very perplexing this season. He's got an excellent offensive scheme that has proven to be successful. He has had a relatively easy schedule. He's got a bevy of weapons. He has a subpar defense that should allow him the opportunity to thrive on volume, yet he has failed to have a single 300-yard game this season, and his rushing upside that flashed in week 1 and that we loved in 2024, that has all but disappeared. Now, the Bengals will likely be without Trey Hendrickson again. While it is possible that Williams puts up a fantasy dud in this matchup, we are talking about a defense that literally allowed Justin Fields to nearly triple his production from the prior 2 weeks combined. Caleb Williams is safe. I know you feel uncomfortable with it, but he is a legitimate top 10 option this week. On the surface, Tyjae Spears might not seem like somebody that you want to play this week because technically he is not the lead back and he is in a committee that should theoretically lean more towards Tony Pollard. However, Spears has been fairly reliable since returning from his injury because he is a consistent presence in the passing game. While that pass game does occasionally lean more towards Pollard, we talked about that in the waiver wire video because he is also a very capable receiver, Spears has had a minimum of 3 receptions in each of the past 3 games, and he has finished as RB21, RB32, and RB12 in full PPR over that stretch. It is not much, but compared to a guy that we just talked about like Croskey Merritt, whose floor is legitimately 1 fantasy point, with all these injuries at running backs, you can understand why you might need to turn to Tyjae Spears for a high upside play this week. Now, Spears did have a 1 fantasy point performance, but you just need to ignore that. That was the first game back from his injury. He hadn't played all year, and it was very clear that he was on a limited snap count. He only played 25% of snaps and was just being eased back in. So outside of that, he's actually been fairly reliable. And this week's matchup against the Chargers will likely be a blowout, meaning that we should have a nice solid baseline of pass volume for Spears. Can lightning strike not just twice, but 3 times here with Chimere Dike? Because one of the most common questions that I have had this week is around Chimere Dike and whether or not his production is real. Now, while I do think his production is more about the reduction and subsequent exit of Tyler Lockett, I cannot guarantee that Chimere Dike's production will stick once Calvin Ridley returns from the hamstring injury. But the good news is that I don't think we actually need to assess that for this week. Ridley didn't practice on Wednesday. Obviously, Thursday and Friday practice reports are what really matters, but he didn't appear close last week, and he doesn't appear close this week. So for this week's start-sit decisions, the Titans' offense should be continuing as is. The Chargers are not a fantastic matchup overall for the pass, but Tennessee's last 2 matchups were Indianapolis and New England, and Chimere Dike had no problems with those secondaries, and Dike's alignment should lean towards him being the more trustworthy option of the Titans receivers this week. We can trust him, and oddly enough, he does have upside even within this wayward Titans offense. In week 7, Dike had 4 receptions on 4 targets for 71 yards. Last week, he had 7 receptions on 8 targets for 93 yards. In this week's matchup, again, the Chargers will definitely dominate. The Titans will be pushing decent volume here. He is a risk, but again, we are in on Chimere Dike this week. Christian Watson is back, but be cautious. The Packers are still spreading the ball around. Make no mistake about that. And while they did have struggles with the run game last week, they will likely try and get Josh Jacobs going this week, although watch out for his play status there. But this is a poor matchup against the pass. That's the issue here. The Carolina defense has been stout, and Bryce Young should be back this week, so Carolina will look more like themselves and less like the ugly version that we saw last week with Andy Dalton. When we talked about Watson in the waiver wire video, he had 4 receptions on 4 targets for 85 yards. He looked sharp to his credit coming off of that injury. Now, Watson could absolutely be the Packers' wide receiver 1 this week, but there are legitimately 3+ other guys that they could choose to do that with. Fantasy teams that need a safe option should go another direction. given the matchup here with the tough Panthers secondary. But teams looking for a high upside, high risk, high reward play here, you can technically turn to Christian Watson. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like the video and subscribe to my channel. You can also find me across all social media platforms at It's Sarah Time, so make sure that you are tuned in because I am bringing you more fantasy football content and advice all season long. Every week I've got you covered with waiver wire ads, stashes, live shows, and Q&A where you can ask me any questions, and so much more.